everything happening in Iran, you might be feeling scared, overwhelmed, and confused. But I got you. I'm a journalist and I spent the last few days researching, reading, and talking to experts about this situation. And what I learned blew my mind in several ways that you've really got to hear about. There are 3 big questions I'm going to answer for you in this video. First, what's the deal with Iran's nuclear program, and did the US attack accomplish anything? Next, we'll talk about some analysis of why this might have happened and what Israel or the US might have been thinking. And then finally, we'll talk about what could happen next. And this is where things kind of make my blood run cold, but not necessarily in the way that you'd expect. I'd like to give a special thank you to Dr. Besma Momani, a professor of political science at the University of Waterloo, who I peppered with a million questions earlier today. She is an award-winning academic who has written or collaborated on more than 14 books, and she's an expert on Middle East politics. Okay, let's dive in. We were all stunned and, let's be honest, freaked out when we heard this announcement on Saturday night.
The strikes were a spectacular military success. Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated.
So let's start with a huge question, because Prime Minister Mark Carney put out a statement calling Iran's nuclear program a, quote, grave threat to international security, and said US military action was, quote, designed to alleviate that threat. But was that threat real? Doesn't really sound like it. A key ingredient for nukes is enriched uranium. But there are also non-military reasons to enrich uranium, like for nuclear power. You enrich uranium in a machine called a centrifuge, and it takes a really, really long time. Now, the degree to which you need to enrich uranium for civilian purposes is really low. We're talking like 2 to 4%, around that range. To use it in like a nuclear bomb, you have to enrich it to 90%. But Iran has been enriching uranium to 60%. And something happens when you're enriching uranium and you hit 60%. The time it takes to get from 60% to 90% is way shorter than how long it takes to get to that initial 60%. Like Besma told me, we're talking years for that first chunk and then months for that 60 to 90% stretch. That's why you'll see Netanyahu and others claim that Iran could produce nuclear weapons within a matter of months, because they've got this stockpile of 60% enriched uranium that they could get to that 90% quick. But here's the part that often gets left out in those conversations. Sure, Iran could get to 90% enriched uranium fast, but you can't just throw 90% enriched uranium at people with your bare hands. You gotta take it and put it in an actual warhead. So weaponizing that enriched uranium. And it requires extremely specialized knowledge to know how to build a warhead to put that enriched uranium into, so that you can actually turn it into a real weapon that can be launched. Now, if they had that weaponization, that would make Iran's program a imminent nuclear threat. But no one has ever been able to prove that Iran has these missiles, that technology even, to be able to put that enriched uranium to use in the form of a nuclear weapon. There is no evidence that they have this knowledge or that they've been even trying to gain it, Besma told me. So yeah, that whole claim about the imminent threat of Iran's nuclear capabilities, based on the evidence, phony as hell. Not to mention that the current Khamenei, the supreme leader, put out his own fatwa on the use of nuclear weapons against any population. That's kind of like the Pope issuing a definitive decree against something. Besma told me that most Iran analysts say this was a huge deal and something that culturally will have significant impact on the Iranians. It made the idea of using nuclear weapons like a sin. And on top of all of that, if they use nuclear weapons to attack Israel, that would impact the Palestinians, which is something that Iran doesn't want to do. This is also why it's really stupid that Trump is now trying to go after Khamenei, because if you kill the fatwa guy, the next guy might reissue a new fatwa that permits nukes. So to summarize, there is no evidence that Iran has the capability or even the desire, well, up until this weekend, to weaponize its enriched uranium, because there is no evidence that they currently right now have the actual warhead or the technological know-how to make one. On top of that, the sites that Trump bombed might not have even held the stockpile of enriched uranium. US officials have since come out and said they don't know where the stockpile is and whether it was destroyed in these bombings. So yeah, it doesn't sound like this bombing accomplished much. And it doesn't sound like the initial goal actually made a lot of sense in the first place if the Iranians couldn't actually weaponize their uranium. So that brings us to question 2. Why would the Americans and the Israelis do this, and what were they actually trying to achieve? This is where things get interesting and where we have to do some analysis and some speculation. Besma told me that some US insiders have said that Netanyahu has been trying to get Americans to bomb Iran, citing an imminent nuclear threat for ages. But all those other presidents actually had someone in the room who had more than 3 brain cells who told them, yeah, actually, Iran isn't months away from being able to make a nuke, and we shouldn't do this. Basically, those American presidents didn't take the bait. But as Besma put it, here comes the dummy. And this guy is surrounded by dummies. And if that king dummy gets told he gets to be the hero, you can kind of guess how he got here. Now, to be clear, I don't have any insider intel about how these conversations went, but we do know that Netanyahu has been trying to do this for a while, and he suddenly got his way. So you have to consider what's changed in terms of the US administration. So American stupidity does explain a lot here. But what it doesn't explain is why Netanyahu would have wanted these sites bombed. Especially given that now, as Besma told me, after this attack, Iran is much more likely to rush towards trying to make nukes. So what would Netanyahu's motivation be? Well, he thinks this would make Israel safer, because he views Iran as the brain behind a monster whose arms, groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, are inflicting pain on Israel. So if Netanyahu thinks that Iran is the main problem here, and Iran has either a regime change or is heavily destabilized as a result of civil war, then that problem goes away. But he's wrong. He doesn't realize that a large part of what is driving the animosity for Israel within the region is the fact that it is colonizing, oppressing, and committing genocide against Palestinians. As long as those policies continue, there will continue to be resistance and animosity towards Israel within the region. But Netanyahu doesn't seem to be willing to understand that. So instead, he thinks the solution is to try to destroy Iran. And this is where things get a bit scary, and I hope my analysis is wrong. But there is historical precedent here, so that is why I'm bothering to suggest this. It's the answer to the third question of what happens next. If we accept the premise that Netanyahu's true motivation here is to rid Israel of the threat that is Iran, you have to think about how that could happen. As I mentioned, regime change is a big one. That means a change in the form of governance and the people who run a country, something Trump has tweeted in favor of. Now, I have to do a little sidebar here to give you some context about Iran specifically. People in Iran hate the regime right now. The vast majority there would agree that they don't want to live in a theocracy. But here is the issue that Besma told me about. There is no significant organized opposition movement right now that reflects what the people want. There have been bursts of movements, but right now they've disintegrated. And at the moment, there are only really 2 options for opposition, and neither are options Iranians want. One is Reza Shah, a little nepo baby who likes to hang out in LA and basically sucks. He's also developed a little reputation for being pro-Israel. The other opposition option is the MEK, which is basically a cult. Besma told me that basically no Iranians support them, even though some Americans in Congress talk about them like they're the official opposition. Which makes sense because some prominent Western politicians have rolled up to speak at their events. And apparently the MEK sometimes pays speakers up to $50,000. Neither of those 2 options are especially appealing to Iranians, even though they don't like the current leader either. If this moment was a popular opportunity for an uprising, you would see Iranians in the street, Besma told me, but that's not happening because they don't want the Americans or the Israelis to do this. But if this regime change is what Netanyahu wants, and it's hard to see any other significant motivation for what he's doing right now, beyond maybe a political distraction, he would need boots on the ground in Iran, and he doesn't have enough boots for that. They've been leaning on their reserves for the genocide in Gaza. But you know who does have enough troops? That's right, baby. Netanyahu was able to convince Trump to bomb Iran, but convincing him to put boots on the ground would be a much harder thing to do. And this is where I'm going to bring up a historical example of something that I really hope doesn't happen. But it would be ignorant to pretend that it's not a risk here. See, in 1954, Israel wanted to convince the British and the Americans to stay in this Suez Canal zone. So they undertook a covert operation. But it failed. According to footnotes from a historical document published on the U.S. Office of the Historian's website, Israeli Defense Minister Pinchas Lavon organized a plan to use Egyptian Jews and undercover Israeli agents to bomb American, British, and Egyptian buildings in Cairo. Lavon's goal was to blame the bombings on Arabs, creating the impression of an anti-Western atmosphere and helping convince the British and Americans of the need to have the British stay in the Suez Canal zone. The footnote is from a conversation between Henry Kissinger and President Ford. where Kissinger warns the president that Israel could use a similar tactic to build animosity between the US and the PLO, the official representative of the Palestinians at the time. With that historical context in mind, is there a risk that these tactics could be deployed by Israel again to spur US involvement in Iran? I hope not. That's all I really have to tell you about this situation today. If you have any other questions about this conflict, drop them in the comments. I'm planning to have Besma join me on my podcast this week and can hopefully get you some answers. But until then, what do you think of all this?